But the truth is that I defend the BBC. I think the BBC is fundamentally important to this country and our strength as a democracy. And what has happened today is, I'm afraid, the consequence of creeping right-wing authoritarianism in this country. The people who should be leaving the BBC are not Gary Lineker, not Ian Wright, not Alan Shearer, Richard Sharp, the chairman, the Tory donor, the friend of Sunak, the man who arranges loans for Boris Johnson, Robbie Gibb, the man who used to work in that building where you are, Mark, Millbank, and run BBC political coverage, and be perfectly happy for people to be saying that the BBC was full of left-wing pinkos while he was campaigning for Brexit and campaigning for the Tories, then goes to work for Theresa May, now back on the board. And Anna is absolutely right. This is pandering, cowering in the face of right-wing extremism. We have a right-wing, extreme, authoritarian fringe in the Conservative Party that has got a grip of Sunak, that got rid of Theresa May, that got in Johnson, that got in Truss. And who's next? Who's next? As she said, David Attenborough. His programme's being watered down because they're worried about what the right wing are going to say about climate change. Alan Sugar, who tweeted some vile things about Jeremy Corbyn when he was leader. Now, I would defend his right to do that. But what's the difference? The difference is that this government and their wretched right-wing rags who support them, their propaganda arm like the Mail, the Express, etc., they've created a fuss loud enough for the BBC to go, oh, no, it's not going away, we better get rid of it.
But isn't this much more, isn't this just a simple case of the BBC having its impartiality rules, and one of its major faces, in their view, has broken those impartiality rules? It's as simple as that, in their view, in the BBC's view.
Okay.
And they're trying to negotiate with Gary Lineker and saying, look, if you row this back, you know, we can still carry on.
Right,
but there doesn't seem to be an understanding on what he is prepared to do. It's as simple as that, really, isn't it?
Two things to say to that. One is, if that's what's happened, that they've asked Gary to tone things down and he said no, then what it shows that he's got values and principles in a way that they don't, and this government certainly doesn't. And the second thing I'd say is, if that's the case, when I was involved in the People's Vote campaign, Gary Lineker did an event with us. He was very, very clear where there's no more controversial issue than Brexit, and he got involved in that. If it's a principle at stake here, the BBC should have pulled him aside then, but they didn't. Why? Because there was no big deal. There was no big fuss. There was no government that wanted us to talk about this rather than the wretched, useless, riddled with holes, illegal migrants bill.
Well, so there's a different Director General. There's a different Director General who is making, who wants to make more of this whole impartiality issue, and is, talked to journalists, and he's talked to his current affairs presenters about impartiality, and they think that Gary Lineker's fallen foul of that, and it doesn't matter that he's a sports presenter. He is a member of the BBC, a face of the BBC. Okay, well, look, I like Tim Davie. I think he's a good bloke. I think he's absolutely committed to the BBC. But I'm afraid he's making a complete and total mess of this. And I suspect he's making it because of the feeling of these right-wing pressures from people like Richard Sharp and Robbie Gibb. I'm afraid that they are the people who should be going. And look, I accept that this is difficult. It's a difficult issue. Social media has made it more difficult. But don't devise your principles, in quotes, according to the noise that's going on around you. Devise your principles and then stick to them. What are the values? Because I'm afraid they're just showing such inconsistency. If Gary Lineker had done something wrong when he did that first tweet, the BBC should have been onto it straight away. I know for a fact that they weren't. They wanted to see whether the storm would blow over. That is no way to run a big organisation like the BBC. And I'll tell you, who is next? Who is next? Let's just take this to its logical conclusion. Take Martin Compston. He's an actor in Line of Duty, which is one of the BBC's most successful programmes. It's a massive export. It's an incredible success story. Martin Compston's a very, very big SNP supporter. And nothing wrong with that. He fights for independence. Nothing wrong with that. But does there come a point where the BBC think, oh, my God, that Martin Compston, he's getting a bit political. Brian Cox, the scientist, a massive global asset for the BBC. He hates Brexit and he never stopped saying it. Yeah. Is he going to be stopped from saying that?
And otherwise,
it's clearly
made a
riddled
total
with
mess.
inconsistencies. The whole issue is riddled with inconsistencies. But the BBC has decided, Tim Davie, whoever's decided, that they can't have a view, that he can't have a view on issues that relate to party politics or political controversies. They've decided that. And if they've decided that, what do you think Gary Lineker should do?
Well, look, I suspect because Gary Lineker does have values and does have principles, I suspect we've seen him on Match of the Day for the last time. And I suspect that with Alan Shearer, and may I thank and praise him for that, because I think he's doing. There's a very famous phrase from the 30s, Mark: "Never be a bystander. Never be a bystander." We're watching the creeping authoritarianism within this government.
Yeah,
we see it. We see it in some of the language Sunak used yesterday. We see it in every time Braverman opens her mouth. We see it today with Johnson's people, Nadine Dorries and these other has-been nobodies who should never have been near government, jumping up and down in celebration at Lineker getting done. This is creeping authoritarianism.
Sorry to interrupt, but so if there was a BBC sports presenter tweeting out support for the Conservative government, you'd be quite happy with that?
I wouldn't be happy, but I wouldn't jump up and down and say that guy should never be on television again. We had it the whole time. We had all sorts of people that were against the government when we were in power. We had comedians. We had, Jim Davidson. Did we go around saying Jim Davidson probably shouldn't be on telly because he's a crap comedian, but we didn't do that. This lot, honestly, they think that unless you are 100% lining up behind whatever the gaslighting lie they are telling on that particular day, there's something wrong with you. Yeah. And I hope, honestly, Mark, I really hope this is a wake-up call to our media. I really do. When Johnson was Prime Minister, the guy who we all now know was a complete liar, corrupt, a charlatan, right? He was... No, and let me finish the point. Well, and he was treated by the news organisations like every word had to be treated as gospel. Let me tell you something else. There were two big things happened this week.
We've got to end it at some stage, but briefly.
Well, can I finish this point?
With this one point, yeah, briefly.
Okay, one point, very, very briefly. There's another big story about the media that's out there this week that's had no coverage whatsoever, apart from a bit of take-up in the Times, I think it was, that Boris Johnson is trying to get a peerage for Paul Dacre at the Daily Mail. The Daily Mail, which is hounding Gary Lineker, front page after front page after front page. A corrupt, disgraced Prime Minister trying to honour a man for covering up the investigation into his corruption. Tell me which is worse.